On the morning of March 15, 1944, at approximately 23,000 feet above the Adriatic Sea, Second Lieutenant Marcus Jefferson checked his oxygen mask for the third time in as many minutes. The temperature outside his P-51 Mustang read 42 degrees below zero, and despite the sheepskin-lined flight suit, he could feel the cold seeping into his bones like water through cracked cement. Below him, a formation of 12 B-17 flying fortresses droned steadily northeast toward their target, a strategic industrial complex deep in occupied territory. The mission briefing had promised light resistance. Intelligence had assured them that enemy fighter squadrons had been relocated to defend other sectors. The escort would be routine, they said. A milk run. They were wrong about everything. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What happened over the next 47 minutes would become one of the most legendary aerial encounters of the entire conflict. Her story passed down through generations of pilots, studied in flight schools, and whispered about in officers' clubs from Ramitelli to Tuskegee. It would center on a single maneuver so audacious, so seemingly impossible, that the men who witnessed it would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain what they saw. And at the heart of it all was a young man from Montgomery, Alabama, who had been told his entire life that he did not belong in a cockpit. Marcus Jefferson had grown up in the shadow of Maxwell Field, watching silver aircraft trace patterns across the Alabama sky like brushstrokes on a blue canvas. His father, Samuel Jefferson, worked as a groundskeeper at the airfield, trimming hedges and maintaining the lawns that surrounded the gleaming white buildings where young men learned to fly. Every evening, Samuel would come home with grass stains on his knees and stories about the aircraft he had seen that day, the Curtiss Hawks and Boeing pursuits that seemed to dance through the air with impossible grace. Young Marcus would sit on the porch, listening with wide eyes, and dream of the day he might touch those machines himself. The path from that porch to the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang had been neither straight nor easy. When Marcus was 12 years old, he had walked up to the main gate of Maxwell Field and asked if he could see the airplanes up close. The guard had looked at him with an expression that mixed pity and contempt in equal measure. "Colored boys do not fly airplanes," the guard had said. "That is just the way things are. Go on home now." Marcus had walked away that day with tears burning in his eyes, but something else had taken root in his chest, a determination that would prove stronger than any obstacle placed before him. He had excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and physics, subjects that his teachers assured him would be useless for a young man of his background. He had built model airplanes from scrap wood and newspaper, studying the principles of lift and drag until he could recite them in his sleep. When he heard about the experimental program at Tuskegee, Alabama, where the military was training colored pilots for the first time in history, he had applied immediately. The competition was fierce. Over 1,000 men applied for the first class of cadets, and only 13 were selected. Marcus was among them. The training at Tuskegee Army Airfield was designed to wash out as many candidates as possible. The instructors, many of them skeptical that colored men could master the complexities of aerial combat, pushed the cadets to their breaking points and beyond. They flew in aircraft that were often poorly maintained, with instruments that malfunctioned and engines that sputtered. They trained in the sweltering Alabama heat and the bone-chilling winter cold. They endured insults and sabotage and doubt from nearly every quarter, and they emerged as some of the finest pilots in the entire military. Marcus had earned his wings in March of 1943, exactly 1 year before the mission that would define his legacy. He had been assigned to the 332nd Fighter Group, known informally as the Red Tails, for the distinctive crimson paint on their aircraft's tail sections. The group had been deployed to North Africa and then to Italy, where they flew escort missions for heavy bomber formations. Their job was simple to describe and extraordinarily difficult to execute: protect the bombers at all costs. The men of the 332nd had developed a reputation that set them apart from other fighter groups. While some escort pilots would chase after enemy aircraft, seeking individual glory and confirmed victories, the Red Tails stayed with their bombers. They had adopted an unofficial motto that every pilot knew by heart: "We stay with our bombers." It was a point of pride, a matter of honor. and it had earned them the respect and gratitude of countless bomber crews who knew that when those red-tailed Mustangs appeared on their wing, they had the best protection in the sky. On that morning of March 15th, Marcus was flying as part of a 16-aircraft escort for the B-17 formation. The mission had begun smoothly. They had taken off from Ramitelli Airfield on the eastern coast of Italy at 0730 hours, climbed to altitude over the Adriatic, and rendezvoused with the bombers precisely on schedule. The weather was clear, with unlimited visibility and only scattered clouds at lower altitudes. It was the kind of day that pilots dreamed about, perfect flying conditions that made the aircraft feel like an extension of your own body. Marcus was flying on the right wing of his flight leader, Captain Thomas Anderson, a veteran of 23 missions who had 3 confirmed aerial victories to his credit. Anderson was a meticulous pilot, the kind who checked his instruments every 30 seconds and never deviated from formation without good reason. He had taken Marcus under his wing during his first weeks with the squadron, teaching him the unwritten rules of combat flying that no manual could convey. "Stay calm," Anderson had told him. "The sky is full of men trying to destroy you. But panic will accomplish that faster than any enemy. Think clearly, fly smoothly, and trust your training." The formation was approximately 90 miles from the target when the first call came over the radio. "Bandits, 3 o'clock high," the voice crackled. Multiple bogies coming fast. Marcus looked to his right and up, scanning the sky for the telltale specks that would grow into enemy fighters. For a long moment he saw nothing but blue sky and wispy clouds. Then his stomach tightened. There they were. At first, they looked like a flock of birds in the distance, but they were moving too fast, too purposefully. As they drew closer, the shapes resolved into the distinctive silhouettes of Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, sleek and deadly, their wings glinting in the morning sun. The intelligence briefing had predicted light resistance. Instead, Marcus counted at least 30 enemy fighters, possibly more, diving toward the formation like hawks descending on a field of mice. They were coming from multiple directions, a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm the escort and tear the bomber formation apart. This was not a chance encounter. This was a planned interception, and the Americans had flown directly into it. Captain Anderson's voice came over the radio, steady and calm despite the approaching threat. "All red-tail aircraft, drop tanks, and engage. Protect the bombers." Marcus reached down and toggled the switch to release his external fuel tanks, feeling the aircraft grow lighter and more responsive as the tanks fell away. He pushed the throttle forward, feeling the Packard Merlin engine surge with power, and followed Anderson as they banked toward the incoming fighters. The next several minutes dissolved into a swirling chaos of aircraft and tracers and desperate maneuvers. Marcus had trained for this moment for over a year, but nothing could fully prepare a pilot for the sensory overload of aerial combat. Aircraft crossed his field of vision from every angle, friend and foe alike, their wings flashing in the sunlight. The radio erupted with shouts and warnings and calls for help, a cacophony of voices that made it nearly impossible to distinguish individual transmissions. The smell of cordite filled the cockpit as he fired his guns for the first time in actual combat, sending a stream of 50 caliber rounds toward a Messerschmitt that flashed across his nose. He missed. The enemy fighter rolled away and disappeared below him, and Marcus resisted the urge to follow. Stay with the bombers. That was the mission, and he would not abandon it for the sake of a personal victory. He pulled back on the stick, climbing to regain altitude and position himself between the bombers and the attacking fighters. Around him, the battle raged on. A three-dimensional chess game played at 300 miles per hour, with life and destruction as the stakes. The first B-17 went down approximately 4 minutes into the engagement. Marcus saw it happen from the corner of his eye, a fortress in the middle of the formation, suddenly trailing thick black smoke from its No. 3 engine. The aircraft began to lose altitude, falling out of formation like a wounded bird separating from the flock. He saw parachutes blossom against the blue sky, 1, 2, 3, 4 of them, and then the bomber disappeared into the clouds below. There was no time to count, no time to wonder about the fate of the remaining crew members. The fight continued, Captain Anderson's Mustang took damage during the initial clash, a burst of cannon fire that shattered his canopy and sent fragments of plexiglass swirling through his cockpit. Anderson's voice came over the radio, remarkably calm considering the circumstances. "Red 2, I am hit but still flying. You have the flight." Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline at these words. He was now responsible for the 3 remaining aircraft in his flight, responsible for their tactics and their survival. He had never led in combat before. He forced himself to breathe, to think, to remember his training. The enemy fighters had broken into smaller groups, each one probing the escort for weaknesses, looking for gaps in the defensive screen that would allow them to reach the bombers. Marcus directed his flight to cover the right flank of the formation, where several Focke-Wulf 190s were making repeated passes at the trailing bombers. The Focke-Wulf was a formidable aircraft, heavily armed and ruggedly built, capable of absorbing significant damage and continuing to fight. Engaging them was dangerous, but allowing them to reach the bombers unchallenged was not an option. The engagement settled into a grim pattern of attack and defense, feint and counterfeint. The enemy pilots were skilled and aggressive, clearly veterans of many aerial encounters. They worked in coordinated pairs, one fighter drawing the attention of the escort while his wingman lined up a shot on the bombers. Marcus and his pilots did their best to disrupt these tactics, but the numerical advantage was against them. For every attack they thwarted, another seemed to slip through. It was during one of these defensive maneuvers that Marcus first noticed the B-17 that would change his life. It was flying in the lower left corner of the formation, a position known as Purple Heart Corner for its vulnerability to attack. The aircraft was named Maiden, Missouri, according to the nose art that Marcus could just barely make out, a painting of a young woman in a blue dress against a background of the Missouri state flag. The fortress was flying steadily, maintaining its position in the formation with the discipline that characterized well-trained bomber crews. But Marcus noticed something else. Maiden, Missouri was alone on its flank. The fighter that should have been covering that sector had been drawn away in the initial engagement, and no one had moved to fill the gap. Marcus keyed his radio to alert his wingman, but before he could speak, he saw them. 5 enemy fighters, flying in a loose formation approximately 2 miles out, were positioning themselves for an attack run on Maiden, Missouri. They were Messerschmitt 109s, lighter and faster than the Focke-Wulfs, with a rate of climb that made them particularly dangerous in the slashing attacks they favored. Marcus recognized the tactical setup immediately. 2 of the fighters would make the initial pass, drawing fire from the bombers' gunners and forcing them to track multiple targets. Then the remaining 3 would come in from different angles, overwhelming the defenses and delivering the fatal blows. It was a textbook attack, efficient and deadly, and Maiden, Missouri was directly in its path. Marcus looked around desperately, searching for other red-tail aircraft that might be in position to help. He saw 2 of his squadron mates engaged with enemy fighters to the north, too far away and too occupied to respond. He saw another Mustang trailing smoke, limping toward the coast with its pilot focused solely on survival. The rest of the escort was scattered across the sky, each pilot fighting his own desperate battle. There was no one else. If Maiden, Missouri was going to survive the next 60 seconds, Marcus would have to save it himself. Against 5 enemy fighters. The mathematics of the situation were not encouraging. Even in ideal circumstances, engaging 5 opponents simultaneously was considered inadvisable. The human brain could only track so many variables at once, and each additional enemy multiplied the angles from which death could arrive. The standard doctrine was clear. Never engage when outnumbered by more than 2 to 1. Wait for reinforcements, maintain defensive positioning, and live to fight another day. But doctrine did not account for the 10 men aboard Maiden, Missouri, the pilot and co-pilot, the navigator and bombardier, the flight engineer and radio operator, the 4 gunners who manned the defensive positions. It did not account for the families waiting for those men back home, the mothers and fathers and wives and children who checked their mailboxes each day with equal measures of hope and dread. Doctrine was written in classrooms by men who had never watched a bomber fall from the sky, never seen parachutes that failed to open, never heard the screams over the radio that stopped suddenly and completely. Marcus had seen and heard those things, and he knew that doctrine, however sound, could not be his only guide. He made his decision in the span of a single heartbeat. He pushed the throttle to maximum power and dove toward the enemy formation. The Mustang responded instantly, the engine roaring as the aircraft accelerated past 400 miles per hour. Marcus felt himself pressed back into his seat by the increasing G-forces, felt the controls stiffen as the airspeed climbed toward the aircraft's limits. The 5 Messerschmitts grew rapidly in his windscreen, their silhouettes expanding from specks to recognizable shapes to detailed machines with visible markings and canopies and gun ports. They had not seen him yet. Their attention was focused on the bomber ahead, on the attack run they were preparing to execute. That gave Marcus a few precious seconds of advantage, a few seconds in which surprise might compensate for numbers. He had to make those seconds count. The challenge Marcus faced was not simply one of courage, although courage was certainly required. It was a problem of geometry and timing and psychology, a puzzle that had to be solved at 300 miles per hour with no margin for error. If he simply dove into the enemy formation with guns blazing, he might damage 1 or 2 of them before the others responded. But then he would be in the middle of 5 hostile aircraft, surrounded and outnumbered, and his destruction would be virtually certain. That outcome would not save Maiden, Missouri. It would simply add 1 more casualty to the day's toll. No, Marcus needed a different approach. He needed to disrupt the enemy's attack without placing himself in an untenable position. He needed to use the only advantages he had, surprise, speed, and the willingness to do something unexpected, to change the equation in his favor. And as he dove toward the Messerschmitts as the airspeed indicator crept past 420 miles per hour, a plan began to form in his mind. It was audacious, bordering on insane. It violated nearly every principle of fighter tactics he had ever been taught. And it might, just might, work. The maneuver that Marcus conceived in those frantic seconds would later be analyzed by flight instructors and military historians, diagrammed on chalkboards and debated in academic papers. Some would call it genius, others would call it reckless. Her few would insist it was simply impossible, that no pilot could have executed such a maneuver and survived, that the accounts must have been exaggerated in the retelling. But the men who witnessed it, the pilots in the sky and the crew of Maiden, Missouri, knew what they had seen. They would carry the memory for the rest of their lives, and they would never tire of telling the story. The core of the plan was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. Marcus would dive directly through the enemy formation, passing between the fighters at maximum speed before they could react. But instead of pulling up and attempting to engage them in a turning fight, which he would certainly lose, he would continue his dive toward the earth, dropping like a stone toward the cloud layer below. The enemy pilots, if they followed, would have to abandon their attack on the bomber, and if they did not follow, Marcus would use the clouds to mask his recovery and return to altitude for another pass. The risk was obvious. Diving at maximum speed toward the ground left almost no room for error. If Marcus misjudged his altitude, if he failed to pull up in time, if his aircraft suffered any mechanical failure during the maneuver, he would be finished. There would be no ejection, no parachute, no survival. Just a smoking crater in the Italian countryside and a telegram to his mother in Montgomery. But the alternative was to watch Maiden, Missouri be torn apart while he circled impotently above, and that was something Marcus could not accept. He committed to the plan and adjusted his dive angle to pass directly through the center of the enemy formation. The lead Messerschmitt pilot saw him at the last possible moment. Marcus caught a glimpse of the man's face turning toward him, the sudden recognition of danger, the frantic jerk of the control stick as the pilot tried to evade. Too late. Marcus flashed past him at a combined closing speed of nearly 700 miles per hour, close enough to see the rivets on the enemy's fuselage, close enough to see the black crosses on the wings and the individual exhaust stains on the engine cowling. The Messerschmitt rolled hard to the right, breaking off its attack run. Its pilot focused now entirely on avoiding the collision that had nearly ended his life. The second fighter was directly in Marcus's path, and for a terrifying instant, impact seemed inevitable. Marcus pushed the stick forward, dropping the nose of his Mustang just enough to pass beneath the enemy's belly, so close that he could see the oil streaks on the underside of the fuselage. The roar of the other aircraft's engine filled his cockpit, a sound like thunder that shook his entire airframe. Then it was gone, behind him, and he was through the formation and diving toward the clouds. The remaining 3 Messerschmitts scattered in confusion. One pilot, perhaps the flight leader, attempted to follow Marcus into the dive but quickly realized the danger and pulled up. The others broke in different directions, their coordinated attack completely disrupted. In the span of perhaps 3 seconds, Marcus had transformed a lethal 5-on-1 engagement into chaos, and Maiden, Missouri flew on untouched. But the maneuver was only half complete. Marcus was now diving at over 450 miles per hour, the altimeter unwinding with sickening speed. The scattered clouds that had looked so distant from above were rushing up to meet him, their white masses growing larger and more solid with each passing second. He had to pull up soon, or the question of enemy fighters would become irrelevant. He began applying back pressure to the stick, gently at first, then with increasing force. The Mustang resisted. At high speeds, the control surfaces of any aircraft become less effective, requiring more force to achieve the same result. This phenomenon, known as control stiffening, was well understood by pilots, but understanding it intellectually and experiencing it while diving toward the Earth at terminal velocity were 2 very different things. Marcus pulled harder on the stick, feeling the muscles in his arms strain with the effort. The aircraft began to respond, the nose slowly, agonizingly slowly, coming up toward the horizon. The G-forces mounted, pressing Marcus down into his seat, making his arms feel like they were made of lead. His vision began to narrow, the edges going gray as blood drained from his head under the acceleration. He could not black out. If he lost consciousness now, even for a few seconds, he would not recover in time. He grunted and strained, forcing himself to remain aware, forcing his hands to maintain pressure on the controls. The altimeter spun through 15,000 feet, 12,000, 10,000. The clouds were directly ahead now, a wall of white that filled his windscreen. He was going to hit them. There was no way to avoid it. All he could do was hope that he had enough altitude remaining to complete the pullout before he ran out of sky. Marcus entered the clouds at approximately 8,000 feet, still in a dive, still pulling back on the stick with all his strength. The world outside the cockpit disappeared, replaced by an all-encompassing grayness that robbed him of any visual reference. He was flying on instruments now, trusting the artificial horizon and altimeter to tell him what his eyes could not see. The airspeed was dropping as the pullout progressed, the nose gradually rising, the G-forces beginning to ease. 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. The Mustang burst out of the bottom of the cloud layer at 4,300 feet, nose finally level with the horizon, airspeed down to 280 miles per hour. Below him, Marcus could see the green and brown patchwork of the Italian countryside, the hills and fields and tiny villages that had almost become his final resting place. He was alive. The maneuver had worked. And somewhere above him, Maiden, Missouri was still flying. He allowed himself a single moment of relief, a deep breath that filled his lungs with the cold, oxygen-rich air from his mask. Then he pushed the throttle forward and began to climb, back toward the battle, back toward the bombers, back toward whatever challenges remained. The fight was not over. The mission was not complete, and Marcus Jefferson had no intention of leaving his wingmen or his charges while he still had fuel in his tanks and ammunition in his guns. The climb back to altitude took several minutes, during which Marcus had time to assess the situation and consider his next moves. His aircraft appeared undamaged, the engine running smoothly, the controls responding normally. The radio was full of chatter, pilots calling out targets and positions and warnings, but the overall tone was more controlled than it had been during the initial engagement. The escort was holding, the bombers were maintaining formation, and the enemy attacks were becoming less frequent. Perhaps the tide was turning. Marcus reached the bomber formation at 18,000 feet, approaching from below and behind to avoid being mistaken for an enemy fighter. He could see the red-tail Mustangs scattered around the formation, each one covering its assigned sector, each pilot doing his job despite the exhaustion and stress of the prolonged engagement. And there, in the lower left of the formation, Maiden, Missouri was still flying, her engines steady, her gunners alert. her crew alive because of what Marcus had done. He took up position on the bomber's left wing, flying close enough that he could see the faces of the gunners in the waist windows. One of them, a young man with a flight helmet pushed back on his head, looked over at Marcus and raised his hand in a thumbs up. Marcus returned the gesture, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the sun now streaming through his canopy. This was why he flew. This was why he had endured the doubts and the obstacles and the long journey from that front porch in Montgomery. Not for medals or glory or recognition, but for the knowledge that his skill and courage could make a difference, could bring men home to their families who might otherwise have been lost. The formation continued toward the target, and Marcus continued to fly escort, but the character of the engagement had changed. The initial wave of enemy fighters had been driven off or destroyed, and though scattered threats remained, the overwhelming assault had been blunted. The bombers would reach their target, deliver their payloads, and turn for home. The mission would be recorded as a success, one more entry in the long ledger of operations that were bringing the conflict closer to its conclusion. But for the men of Maiden, Missouri, and for Marcus Jefferson, the mission would always mean something more. As the formation droned on toward the target, Marcus reflected on the events of the past hour. He thought about the maneuver he had executed, the dive that had seemed so impossible, but had worked precisely as he had envisioned. He thought about the enemy pilots he had scattered, professionals who had been on the verge of claiming another victory, and had instead been forced to flee in confusion. He thought about the 10 men aboard Maiden, Missouri, strangers whose names he did not know but whose lives he had saved. And he thought about what his father had told him years ago on that porch in Montgomery, when Marcus had come home in tears after being turned away from the airfield. The guard was wrong, his father had said. Not just wrong about what colored men can do, but wrong about the way things have to be. The way things are is not the way they have to stay. Every time someone does something they said could not be done, the world changes a little. It might not happen fast. It might not happen in your lifetime, but it happens, and you get to decide if you will be one of the people who makes it happen. Marcus had not fully understood those words at the time. He had been too young, too hurt, too focused on the immediate injustice to see the larger truth his father was trying to convey. But now, at 23,000 feet over occupied Europe, flying an aircraft that he had been told he could never fly, defending men who might have doubted him before they saw what he could do, he understood. He was not just flying a mission. He was not just fighting an enemy. He was proving something that needed to be proven, demonstrating a capability that needed to be demonstrated, changing the way things were into the way they could be. The target appeared on the horizon, a complex of industrial buildings and railway lines that produced materials critical to the enemy's war effort. The bombers would be over the target in approximately 6 minutes, at which point they would release their payloads and turn for home. The mission was entering its most dangerous phase. Anti-aircraft defenses would be intense over the target, and any remaining enemy fighters would make their final attempts to bring down the bombers before they could complete their runs. Marcus checked his instruments, tightened his grip on the controls, and prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. He did not know, could not have known, that the most remarkable chapter of this day was yet to be written. The dive through the enemy formation had been extraordinary, a moment of tactical brilliance and physical courage that would be remembered for generations. But it was only the beginning of what Marcus Jefferson would accomplish in the skies over Europe on March 15th, 1944. The story of that day was far from over, and the most incredible part was still to come. The bombers reached their initial point and began their final approach to the target. The formation tightened, each aircraft taking its precise position for the bomb run, the pilots holding steady, despite the increasingly intense defensive fire that was beginning to rise from the ground below. Marcus could see the dark puffs of anti-aircraft bursts appearing in the sky ahead, seemingly random at first, but gradually forming a pattern designed to create a curtain of destruction through which the bombers would have to fly. It was a gauntlet, pure and simple, and there was no way around it. The only path to the target was through the fire. Marcus felt a familiar tension in his chest as the formation entered the flak zone. Escorting bombers through anti-aircraft fire was one of the most helpless feelings a fighter pilot could experience. His aircraft was too small and too fast to be effectively targeted by the ground defenses, but the bombers were slow and predictable, flying straight and level to give their bombardiers the stable platform they needed for accurate aiming. They could not evade, could not maneuver, could only fly on through the explosions and hope that luck and statistics would see them through. And all Marcus could do was watch. The first bomber took a direct hit approximately 30 seconds into the flak zone. The shell detonated against the No. 2 engine nacelle, sending a sheet of flame across the left wing. The aircraft lurched, yawed violently to the left, then began a slow roll from which it would never recover. Marcus watched as the fortress fell away from the formation, trailing fire and smoke, its crew fighting to regain control of a machine that was already beyond saving. He saw parachutes begin to appear, small white canopies that blossomed against the grey smoke, and he counted them automatically. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 men out of 10. Perhaps more would follow. Perhaps not. The formation closed ranks and continued toward the target. The gap left by the fallen bomber already filled by the aircraft behind it. This was the brutal mathematics of strategic bombing, the cold calculus that measured success in payloads delivered and targets destroyed, rather than in individual lives. Every man in the formation understood this calculus, accepted it as a condition of the mission, but that did not make it any easier to watch a fellow crew fall from the sky. The bonds between bomber crews were strong, forged in shared hardship and mutual dependence, and each loss was felt throughout the group. Marcus forced himself to focus on his responsibilities. There was nothing he could do for the fallen bomber, nothing he could do about the flak that continued to burst around the formation. His job was to protect against fighters, to keep his eyes scanning the sky for any sign of enemy aircraft that might attempt to exploit the chaos of the bomb run. He quartered the sky methodically, checking each sector in turn, searching for the telltale specks that would indicate approaching threats. The sky appeared clear, but that meant nothing. Enemy fighters could appear with almost no warning, diving from above or climbing from below, using the sun or the clouds to mask their approach until they were almost within firing range. The formation was approximately 90 seconds from the target when Marcus saw them. They were high and to the right, perhaps 5,000 feet above the bombers, and they were diving fast. He counted quickly, trying to get an accurate number before they disappeared against the glare of the sun. 4, 5, 6 aircraft, maybe more, coming down in a steep, slashing attack that would carry them through the formation in seconds. They had timed their approach perfectly, waiting until the bombers were committed to the bomb run and unable to take evasive action. It was a classic fighter tactic, and it was aimed directly at the heart of the formation. Marcus keyed his radio and called out the threat, his voice steady despite the adrenaline that was flooding his system. Bandits, 4 o'clock high, diving on the formation. All red-tail aircraft engage. He heard acknowledgements from other pilots in the escort, heard the calls as they spotted the attackers and began to respond. But Marcus knew instantly that they were too far away, too scattered to intercept the enemy before they reached the bombers. The attack would get through. The only question was how much damage it would do. And then he saw where the attack was aimed. The lead enemy fighter was diving directly toward Maiden, Missouri. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as he recognized the tactical situation. The bomber was still in Purple Heart Corner, still vulnerable on its left flank, still in the same position that had nearly led to its destruction earlier in the mission. The enemy pilot, whether by chance or design, was targeting the same aircraft that Marcus had saved with his desperate dive through the formation. And this time, there was no opportunity for surprise. The enemy fighters were committed to their attack, diving at maximum speed, and they would reach the bomber in a matter of seconds. There was no time for elaborate maneuvers, no time for clever tactics. There was only time for one thing. Marcus pushed his throttle to maximum power and turned directly into the path of the diving fighters. It was not a rational decision, in the sense that no calculation of odds or assessment of tactics could justify it. The enemy aircraft had the altitude advantage, the speed advantage, and the numerical advantage. They were diving out of the sun, difficult to see and impossible to engage effectively from below. By placing himself in their path, Marcus was virtually guaranteeing his own destruction. A single burst from any of the attacking fighters would be enough to finish him, and there were at least 6 of them coming down. The odds were not merely unfavorable, they were impossible. But Marcus did not think about odds in that moment. He thought about Maiden, Missouri and her crew, the men who had already survived one attack that day because of what he had done. He thought about the families waiting for those men, the letters that would have to be written if the bomber went down, the empty chairs at dinner tables across America. He thought about his own family, his father and mother in Montgomery, and what they would feel if they learned that he had died in combat. And he thought about what he was fighting for, not just the immediate mission or the larger conflict, but the principle that every life mattered, that courage and skill should be used in service of others, that some things were worth risking everything to protect. He thought about all of these things, and he flew into the path of the enemy. The lead Messerschmitt saw him coming and adjusted its aim, the pilot recognizing the threat and responding with professional precision. Marcus saw the winking lights on the enemy's wings as the guns began to fire, saw the tracers reaching toward him like glowing fingers, and threw his aircraft into a violent, evasive maneuver. The Mustang rolled and pitched, the G-forces slamming Marcus against his harness, the tracers flashing past his canopy, close enough that he could hear their passage over the roar of the engine. He was not trying to shoot down the enemy fighter. He was trying to survive long enough to disrupt its attack, to force it off its aim, to give Maiden, Missouri a few more seconds of life. The first attacker flashed past him, its guns falling silent as it overshot, and began to pull up for another pass. Marcus rolled hard to the left and pulled his nose toward the second fighter, which was now directly in front of him. He pressed the trigger on his control stick, sending a stream of .50 caliber rounds toward the enemy aircraft, not aiming so much as filling the sky with metal, in the hope that something would connect. The Messerschmitt jinked hard to avoid the fire, its attack run spoiled, its pilot now focused on defense rather than offense. 2 down. 4 to go. The third and fourth fighters came at Marcus almost simultaneously, one from above and one from the left. He was caught between them with no good option and no time to think. He did the only thing he could do. He pointed his nose directly at the ground and dove. The maneuver was similar to what he had done earlier, a maximum performance dive designed to build speed and put distance between himself and his attackers. But this time, he was not trying to escape. He was trying to draw the enemy fighters away from the bomber, to make himself such an attractive target that they could not resist the chance to destroy him. It was a gamble, and it depended entirely on the psychology of his opponents. If they stayed disciplined, if they maintained their focus on Maiden, Missouri, the gamble would fail. But Marcus was betting that they would not, could not, pass up the opportunity to shoot down a lone American fighter who had just disrupted their carefully planned attack. He was right. 2 of the remaining fighters followed him into the dive, their pilots hungry for revenge or glory, or simply unable to resist the chase. The other 2 continued toward the bomber formation, but they were off their angles now, their approach disrupted by the chaos that Marcus had created. Their attack runs would be hurried and inaccurate, far less likely to find their mark than the coordinated assault they had originally planned. Maiden, Missouri would have a chance, but Marcus's own chances were dwindling rapidly. He was diving at over 400 miles per hour, with 2 enemy fighters on his tail and the Italian countryside rushing up to meet him. The Messerschmitts were faster in a dive than the Mustang, and they were gaining on him, their tracers reaching closer and closer to his aircraft. He could hear rounds striking his fuselage, the hammer-like impacts that meant his luck was running out. A burst tore through his left wing, shredding aluminum and severing cables. The aircraft lurched violently, and Marcus fought the controls to keep from spinning. He was approaching the cloud layer again, the same gray mass that had saved him before. If he could reach it, he might be able to lose his pursuers, to use the concealment to turn and climb and come at them from an unexpected angle. But the clouds were still several thousand feet below him, and the enemy fighters were closing the gap with every second. He was not going to make it. And then Marcus saw something that changed everything. Directly ahead of him, rising from the clouds like a shark from the depths of the ocean, was a P-51 Mustang with a red tail. It was Captain Anderson. The damaged fighter that Marcus had assumed was out of the battle had not returned to base after all. Anderson had stayed in the area, nursing his crippled aircraft, waiting for an opportunity to rejoin the fight. And now he was climbing directly into the path of the two Messerschmitts that were chasing Marcus, his guns blazing, his intent unmistakable. He was going to take them head-on. The enemy pilots reacted instantly, breaking off their pursuit of Marcus to deal with this new threat. One rolled hard to the right, trying to evade Anderson's fire. The other pulled up, attempting to use his altitude to gain an advantage. In that moment of confusion, that split second when the Messerschmitts were focused on Anderson instead of Marcus, the situation changed completely. Marcus was no longer the prey. He was the hunter. He pulled back on his stick with all his strength, hauling the damaged Mustang's nose up toward the sky, feeling the G-forces build to the edge of blackout. His vision tunneled, the world narrowing to a small point of light directly ahead. But in that small point, he could see the belly of the Messerschmitt that had pulled up. Now hanging nearly motionless at the top of its climb, its energy bled away by the steep pull-up, its pilot just beginning to realize his mistake. Marcus pressed the trigger. The burst was short, no more than 2 seconds, but it was enough. His rounds struck the Messerschmitt's engine cowling and cockpit, shattering metal and glass, silencing the aircraft's guns forever. The fighter fell away, trailing smoke. Its pilot slumped in the cockpit and disappeared into the clouds below. Marcus had his first aerial victory, and the mission was far from over. He rolled his wings level and looked around, searching for Anderson and the remaining Messerschmitt. He found them almost immediately, engaged in a twisting fight approximately 1,000 feet below him. Anderson was at a disadvantage. His aircraft damaged and sluggish, unable to match the enemy's maneuvers. The Messerschmitt pilot was good, working for position, trying to line up a shot that would finish the crippled Mustang. It was only a matter of time before he succeeded. Marcus pushed his nose down and dove toward the fight, his speed building despite the damage to his own aircraft. He had one chance to save his flight leader, one pass before the enemy pilot realized he was there, and took evasive action. He lined up his shot carefully, leading the Messerschmitt by what he judged to be the right amount, and pressed the trigger. The burst caught the enemy fighter in the wing root, where the wing joined the fuselage. It was a vulnerable spot on any aircraft, packed with fuel tanks and control cables and structural members. The Messerschmitt shuddered, a piece of its wing tearing away in the slipstream, and began to spiral toward the ground. Marcus saw no parachute emerge from the stricken aircraft, and he felt a momentary pang of regret for the man he had just defeated. But there was no time to dwell on it. The fight continued. He pulled up alongside Anderson's Mustang and inspected the damage. It was worse than he had thought. The canopy was shattered, the fuselage was perforated with holes, and the engine was trailing a thin stream of smoke. Anderson himself was visible in the cockpit, his flight suit stained with what might have been oil or might have been something worse. But he was alive, and he was still flying. And he raised his hand in a gesture that might have been a salute or might have been a simple acknowledgement of what they had just accomplished together. 2 more victories, and Maiden, Missouri was still flying. The return flight to Ramitelli was a blur of exhaustion and vigilance. The enemy fighters had finally broken off, their attacks blunted by the escort's determined defense, and the surviving bombers turned for home with their mission accomplished. Marcus flew on Anderson's wing, watching the damaged Mustang carefully for any sign that it might fail completely, ready to mark the position if his flight leader was forced to bail out. But Anderson held on, nursing his aircraft across the Adriatic, and they landed at Ramitelli within seconds of each other. The ground crew rushed to the aircraft as soon as they rolled to a stop, pulling the canopies open and helping the pilots out. Marcus climbed down from his cockpit on shaking legs, his flight suit soaked with sweat, despite the cold at altitude, his hands trembling from the adrenaline that was still coursing through his system. He had done it. He had survived. And he had saved the men of Maiden, Missouri not once but twice, through a combination of skill and courage and determination that he had not known he possessed. Captain Anderson walked over to him, moving slowly, one hand pressed against his side where a fragment had grazed him during the initial attack. His face was pale beneath the grime and the stubble, but his eyes were clear, and there was something in them that Marcus had never seen before. Respect. Not the grudging acknowledgement that colored pilots sometimes received from those who doubted their abilities, but genuine, unconditional respect from one warrior to another. "That dive through the formation," Anderson said quietly, "I have never seen anything like that. And that second fight, when you came back for me." He shook his head slowly. "I did not think we were going to make it, none of us did. But you made it happen." Marcus did not know what to say. The words felt inadequate, the emotions too complex to express in simple sentences. He had done what he was trained to do, what he felt he had to do, and he had succeeded. Beyond that, he could not articulate what the day had meant to him. So he simply nodded and offered his hand, and Anderson took it in a grip that said everything that words could not. The story of what happened on March 15th, 1944, spread quickly through the red tails and beyond. Pilots told other pilots, who told ground crew, who told mechanics, who wrote letters home, describing the incredible events they had heard about. Within days, the tale had reached the bomber crews, including the men of Maiden, Missouri, who learned that they owed their lives to a young colored pilot from Alabama who had done the impossible not once but twice in a single mission. Some of them wrote to Marcus directly, expressing their gratitude in words that he would keep for the rest of his life. Others simply passed the word along, making sure that everyone knew what the Red Tails had done. But the story did not end there. The events of that day set in motion a chain of consequences that would extend far beyond the skies over Europe, far beyond the conflict itself, far beyond the lifetimes of the men who had lived through it. The legend of Marcus Jefferson and his impossible dive would become part of the larger story of the Tuskegee Airman, a symbol of what courage and skill could accomplish in the face of overwhelming odds. It would inspire other young men who had been told they did not belong in the cockpit, young men who would go on to fly in conflicts around the world and eventually break through every barrier that remained. And for Marcus himself, the mission of March 15th was only the beginning. The war continued, and he continued to fly, racking up more hours and more missions and more victories. But no mission would ever quite match that day over the Adriatic. That morning when he had learned what he was truly capable of and had proven it to himself and to the world. He would carry the memory with him through all the years that followed, through the struggles for equality that awaited him back home, through the challenges and triumphs of a life well lived. And whenever someone asked him about the war, about what it was like to fly and fight in the skies over Europe, he would think of Maiden, Missouri, and the men he had saved, and he would know that it had all been worth it. The complete story of what happened that day, the full measure of its significance and its consequences, cannot be told in a single sitting. It requires the telling of what came before and what came after, the context that gives meaning to the events and the aftermath that reveals their true importance. The dive through the enemy formation was remarkable, perhaps the most remarkable flying of the entire conflict. But it was only one chapter in a longer story, a story of courage and determination, and the slow, painful process of changing the way things are into the way they should be. That story continues in the second part of this account. Please request part 2 to continue the narrative and discover the full consequences of Marcus Jefferson's incredible actions, the lives he touched, and the legacy he left behind. The days following the mission of March 15th brought a strange mixture of normalcy and celebrity to Marcus Jefferson's life at Ramitelli Airfield. The routine of military service continued unabated, the briefings and maintenance checks and training flights that filled the hours between combat missions. But something had changed in the way people looked at him, in the way they spoke to him, in the small gestures of respect that he noticed from pilots and ground crew alike. Word of what he had done had spread through the base like wildfire, and though Marcus tried to deflect the attention, insisting that he had simply done his job, the story had taken on a life of its own. Captain Anderson was instrumental in spreading the account, describing the dive through the enemy formation to anyone who would listen with a mixture of awe and disbelief that lent the tale an air of legend. "I've been flying combat missions for over a year," Anderson would say, shaking his head slowly. "I have seen good pilots and great pilots and pilots who should never have been allowed in a cockpit, but I have never seen anyone do what Jefferson did that day. He flew into 5 enemy fighters alone. Alone. And he came out the other side with all of them scattered and the bomber untouched. Then he did it again when they came back. That is not just skill. That is something else entirely." The men of Maiden, Missouri added their own voices to the chorus. The bomber had returned to its base in southern Italy on the afternoon of March 15th, its crew shaken but unharmed, its airframe intact despite the chaos that had swirled around it. The pilot, Captain Robert Mitchell, had immediately begun asking questions about the fighter escort that had protected them, specifically about the red-tailed Mustang that had appeared at the critical moments when destruction seemed certain. When he learned the identity of the pilot, he sat down and wrote a letter that would find its way to Marcus within a week. "Dear Lieutenant Jefferson," the letter began, "I'm writing to express the gratitude of myself and my entire crew for what you did on March 15th. We saw your aircraft dive through those enemy fighters like nothing I have ever witnessed in 18 months of combat flying. We saw you turn into the second attack when any sane man would have run the other way, and we saw you drive them off when they should have torn us to pieces. There are 10 men who will go home to their families because of what you did that day. 10 men who will see their wives and children and parents again because you put yourself between us and the enemy. I do not have the words to express what that means to us, but I wanted you to know that we will never forget it. We will never forget you." The letter was signed by all 10 members of the crew, their names arranged in a column beneath Captain Mitchell's signature. Marcus read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in the pocket of his flight jacket, where it would remain for the rest of his tour. He had received commendations before, official recognitions of his skill and service, but nothing had ever meant as much to him as those words from the men whose lives he had saved. This was why he flew. This was the purpose that gave meaning to all the training and sacrifice and risk. But even as Marcus savored the recognition, he understood that the true significance of what he had done extended far beyond the personal. The Tuskegee Airmen had been fighting 2 wars since their activation, the war against the enemy overseas and the war against prejudice at home. They had been told repeatedly that colored men lacked the intelligence, the courage, and the discipline to be effective combat pilots. They had been denied opportunities, given inferior equipment, and assigned to secondary roles in the hope that they would fail and prove the doubters right. And they had responded by compiling one of the finest records of any fighter group in the entire theater of operations. The mission of March 15th was another chapter in that ongoing struggle, another piece of evidence that could not be ignored or explained away. A colored pilot had done the impossible, had saved a bomber crew through sheer skill and courage, had proven himself the equal of any pilot in any air force in the world. That fact would be recorded and reported and remembered, and it would make it just a little bit harder for anyone to claim that men like Marcus did not belong in the cockpit. The change would not happen overnight. Prejudice was stubborn, deeply rooted in traditions and assumptions that would take generations to fully overcome. But it would happen. Every mission like this one brought it closer. Marcus flew 12 more combat missions over the following 6 weeks, escorting bombers to targets across occupied Europe. The pattern of the work became familiar. The early morning briefings and the long flights over water and the tense hours over enemy territory. He engaged enemy fighters on 3 more occasions, adding 1 more victory to his record, and he escorted countless bombers through flak and fighters to their targets and back. Each mission was dangerous. Each one carried the possibility that he would not return, but he had found a rhythm to the work that allowed him to function effectively, despite the fear that never entirely went away. The fear was something that pilots rarely discussed openly, though all of them felt it. It was there in the quiet moments before a mission, in the tightness of the chest and the dryness of the mouth that no amount of water could relieve. It was there in the seconds before engaging an enemy, when the mind calculated odds and outcomes with cold precision. And it was there in the nights after combat, when sleep came slowly and was filled with dreams of tracers and falling aircraft and the faces of men who had not come back. Some pilots dealt with the fear by ignoring it, pushing it down into some deep part of themselves where it could not interfere with their duties. Others acknowledged it openly, joking about it in the officers' club as a way of robbing it of its power. Marcus had found his own approach, a combination of discipline and faith and the simple determination to do his job regardless of how he felt. The fear was real, but it was not in charge. He was. The spring of 1944 turned to summer, and the pace of operations intensified as the Allies prepared for the decisive campaigns that would determine the outcome of the conflict. The strategic bombing offensive reached its peak, with hundreds of heavy bombers striking targets deep in enemy territory every day that weather permitted. The Tuskegee Airmen flew escort for many of these missions, protecting the formations from fighter attacks and earning a reputation that spread throughout the bomber force. The Red Tails never lost a bomber to enemy fighters. That was the claim that the men repeated with pride, and while the precise accuracy of the statement would be debated by historians in the decades to come, the essential truth behind it was undeniable. The 332nd Fighter Group was one of the finest escort units in the war, and the bomber crews knew it. Marcus's reputation grew along with that of his unit. The story of his dive through the enemy formation had become part of the Red Tails legend, recounted to new pilots as an example of what courage and skill could accomplish. Some versions of the tale grew more elaborate with each telling, adding details that Marcus did not remember, and feats that he was fairly certain he had not performed. He tried to correct these exaggerations when he heard them, but the story had taken on a momentum of its own. It had become larger than the actual events, a symbol that meant more than any mere factual account could convey. Marcus learned to accept this, understanding that the story served a purpose that transcended his own experience. It inspired, it motivated, it showed what was possible, and that was more important than strict historical accuracy. In July of 1944, Marcus was promoted to the rank of first lieutenant in recognition of his service and his victories. The ceremony was brief and informal, conducted by the squadron commander in front of the assembled pilots, but it meant more to Marcus than he could easily express. He thought of all the obstacles he had overcome to reach this point, all the people who had told him he could not succeed, all the doors that had been closed in his face. And here he was, a commissioned officer in the United States military, a combat pilot with 3 confirmed aerial victories, a man who had proven himself in the most demanding arena imaginable. He wished his father could see him. He wished everyone who had ever doubted him could see him. The promotion came with new responsibilities. Marcus was now a flight leader, responsible not just for his own aircraft, but for the 3 other pilots in his flight. He took this responsibility seriously, spending hours with his wingmen going over tactics and procedures, making sure they understood what was expected of them and what they could expect from him. He drew on his own experience, on the lessons he had learned from Captain Anderson, and from his own successes and mistakes. And he tried to instill in them the same philosophy that had guided him since his first day of flight training. Stay calm, think clearly, trust your training, and never, ever abandon your wingmen or your bombers. The summer months brought some of the most intense fighting of the air war, as the enemy threw every available resource into defending the territory that remained under their control. The fighter group suffered casualties that would have seemed unimaginable at the start of the conflict, losing pilots at a rate that sometimes made it difficult to maintain operational strength. The 332nd was not immune to these losses. Marcus watched friends and comrades fail to return from missions, saw empty bunks in the barracks and vacant seats in the mess hall, and felt the weight of each loss like a physical blow. But he continued to fly, continued to lead, continued to do his duty. That was what the fallen would have wanted. That was what honor required. It was during this period that Marcus received word about Maiden, Missouri. The bomber had continued to fly missions after March 15th, her crew completing their combat tour and rotating back to the United States. Captain Mitchell had written to Marcus again before leaving, thanking him once more for what he had done and promising to tell the story to everyone he met. "I want people to know what you did," Mitchell had written. "I want them to understand what kind of men are flying those red-tailed Mustangs. You saved our lives, and the least I can do is make sure your story is heard." Mitchell was true to his word. When he returned to the United States, he gave interviews to newspapers and spoke at bond rallies, and told anyone who would listen about the colored pilot who had saved his crew. The story spread across the country, appearing in papers from New York to California, and it added to the growing recognition of what the Tuskegee Airmen were accomplishing overseas. Marcus did not learn about this publicity until much later, but the effects were significant. Public opinion was slowly shifting, influenced by stories like this one and by the undeniable record of achievement that the colored pilots were compiling. The doubters were not silenced, but they were losing ground. In September of 1944, Marcus flew his 50th combat mission. It was a milestone that few pilots reached, a testament to skill and luck and the simple grace of having survived when so many others had not. The mission itself was unremarkable, a routine escort to a target in southern Germany, with only scattered opposition and no losses among the bombers. But when Marcus landed at Ramitelli and climbed out of his cockpit, he found the entire squadron waiting for him on the flight line. They cheered and applauded and pounded him on the back, and someone produced a bottle of something that was definitely not authorized, but was enthusiastically consumed nonetheless. It was one of the happiest moments of Marcus's life. The celebration was bittersweet, though, because Marcus knew that his time in combat was coming to an end. Military policy required that pilots be rotated out of combat after a certain number of missions to prevent the exhaustion and psychological strain that could compromise their effectiveness and lead to preventable losses. Marcus had mixed feelings about this policy. Part of him was relieved at the thought of leaving the constant danger behind, of not having to face the fear and the uncertainty every time he climbed into the cockpit. But another part of him felt that he was abandoning his comrades, leaving them to fight on without him while he went somewhere safe. It was a conflict that many combat veterans experienced, and there was no easy resolution. His final mission came on September 28, 1944, exactly 6 months and 13 days after the mission that had made him famous. It was another escort to Germany, another long flight over water and mountains and enemy territory. The weather was poor, with thick clouds obscuring the ground and making navigation difficult, but the mission proceeded as planned. Marcus flew on the wing of his replacement, a young second lieutenant named William Carter, who had arrived at Ramitelli just 3 weeks earlier. He tried to pass on what wisdom he could during the flight, pointing out landmarks and explaining procedures, but his mind kept wandering to thoughts of what awaited him when they returned. The mission was successful. The bombers reached their target, released their payloads, and turned for home without loss. There were no enemy fighters, no dramatic encounters, no moments of heroism or terror. Just another day of work in the long, grinding campaign that was slowly bringing the conflict to its end. When Marcus landed at Ramitelli for the last time as a combat pilot, he felt a strange emptiness, a sense that something important was ending without any proper ceremony to mark its passing. But that was the nature of military service. You did your job, and then you moved on, and someone else took your place. The mission continued. Marcus spent the next 2 weeks at Ramitelli, completing paperwork and briefing his replacement and saying goodbye to the men he had served with. Some of these farewells were painful, particularly the ones with pilots he had flown with since the early days, men who had become closer than brothers through shared experience and mutual trust. He promised to write, promised to stay in touch, knowing even as he said the words that the war would scatter them across the globe, and that some of them would not survive to fulfill those promises. Such was the nature of wartime friendships. They burned bright and brief, and they left marks that lasted a lifetime. His last night at Ramitelli, Marcus walked out to the flight line alone and stood looking at the Mustangs lined up in their revetments. The aircraft were silent now, their engines cold, their guns empty, but in his mind he could still hear them as they had sounded in combat. The roar of the Merlins and the hammering of the 50 calibers and the rush of wind past the canopy. These machines had carried him through more danger than he had ever imagined he would face, had responded to his commands with a precision and reliability that had saved his life countless times. He had cursed them when they malfunctioned and blessed them when they performed, had felt more connected to them than to almost any other object he had ever known. And now he was leaving them behind. He reached out and placed his hand on the cold metal of the nearest aircraft, feeling the smoothness of the aluminum skin, the slight texture of the paint. "Goodbye," he said quietly. "And thank you." The journey home took Marcus across the Atlantic by ship, a voyage of several days that gave him time to decompress and reflect. He stood at the rail for hours, watching the grey ocean slide past, thinking about what he had experienced and what awaited him. The war would continue without him, would grind on for however many more months or years until the enemy was finally defeated. Other men would fly the missions that he had flown, would face the fears that he had faced, would save lives and lose them in the endless calculus of conflict. And Marcus would be back in Alabama, a civilian again, trying to figure out what came next. The return to the United States was jarring in ways that Marcus had not anticipated. He had been gone for over a year, immersed in the all-consuming world of combat operations, and the country he came back to seemed both familiar and strange. The cities were the same, the streets and buildings and parks that he remembered from before, but everything felt different somehow, smaller and quieter and less urgent. The war was still on, still dominating the newspapers and the radio broadcasts, but for people at home it was an abstraction, a distant drama that affected their lives in limited and manageable ways. For Marcus it was anything but abstract. It was still there, in his dreams and his reflexes, and the way he scanned the sky whenever he was outdoors. He returned to Montgomery to see his family, arriving at the small house near Maxwell Field on a cool October afternoon. His mother was waiting on the porch, her face a mixture of joy and relief that made Marcus's throat tighten. She held him for a long time without speaking, her arms around him like she would never let go, and he let her, feeling the warmth and the safety that only a mother's embrace could provide. His father stood behind her, older and grayer than Marcus remembered, his eyes shining with an emotion that he would not name but that Marcus understood completely. They wanted to hear everything, of course. They wanted to know what he had seen and done and felt, wanted to understand what their son had experienced in the skies over Europe. Marcus told them what he could, editing out the worst parts, the terror and the loss and the things he had done that still haunted his sleep. He told them about the missions and the friendships and the small moments of humor and camaraderie that made the hardship bearable. And he told them about March 15th, about the dive through the enemy formation and the saving of Maiden, Missouri, because that was the story they most wanted to hear, and because it was the story he most wanted to tell. His father listened in silence, nodding occasionally, his weathered hands clasped in his lap. When Marcus finished, he sat quietly for a long moment, looking at his son with an expression that seemed to contain a lifetime of thoughts and feelings. Then he spoke. "I am proud of you," Samuel Jefferson said. "Not just because of what you did in the war, though that is part of it. I am proud because of who you are. You took everything they threw at you, all the doubt and the obstacles and the people telling you that you could not succeed, and you showed them what you were made of. You did not let them define you, you defined yourself, and that is the most important victory of all." Marcus felt tears prick at his eyes, and he did not try to stop them. He had faced enemy fighters without flinching, had flown into situations where death seemed certain, but his father's words broke through his defenses in a way that no enemy ever could. He had wanted this approval, this recognition since he was a boy on this very porch, watching the airplanes and dreaming of the day he might fly them. And now he had it. Now he knew. The weeks that followed were a time of adjustment and planning. Marcus was officially discharged from the military in November, his service complete, his record distinguished. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions on March 15th, along with several other decorations that recognized his overall service. The medals were meaningful, but Marcus knew they were not the end of his story. They were just markers along a much longer journey. The country he returned to was not the same as the one he had left. The war had changed things, had set in motion forces that would reshape American society in ways that no one could fully predict. Colored men had served with distinction in every theater of operations, had proven their capabilities beyond any reasonable doubt, and they were not willing to come home and accept the same limitations and injustices that had defined their lives before. A movement was building, still small but growing, that would challenge the foundations of segregation and discrimination and demand the equality that had been promised but never delivered. Marcus did not know what role he would play in that movement, but he knew he would play some role. He had not overcome so much just to accept the unacceptable. In the meantime, he had to decide what to do with his life. Flying was the obvious answer. It was what he was trained for, what he was best at, what he loved most in the world. But opportunities for colored pilots in civilian aviation were almost non-existent. The airlines would not hire them. The charter services would not hire them. Even the military, which had trained them and decorated them and praised their accomplishments, was already talking about returning to the segregated structures of the pre-war period. The doors that Marcus had worked so hard to open were in danger of closing again. He refused to let them close. In January of 1945, Marcus enrolled in an advanced flying course at Tuskegee, using the skills and credentials he had earned in combat to qualify for instructor certification. If he could not fly for the airlines, he would teach others to fly. He would pass on what he had learned, the techniques and the discipline and the mindset that had made him successful, and he would help create a new generation of pilots who would continue the fight. It was not the career he had imagined when he was a boy on the porch, but it was meaningful work, and it kept him in the cockpit where he belonged. The war ended in August of 1945, first in Europe and then in the Pacific, and the country erupted in celebration. Marcus joined in the joy, relieved that the fighting was finally over, that no more of his friends and comrades would be lost in combat. But he also knew that the end of the war was not the end of the struggle. The harder fight, the fight for equality and justice, and the full recognition of what the Tuskegee Airmen had accomplished, was just beginning. That fight would take decades and would involve setbacks and frustrations that sometimes seemed insurmountable. But it would also bring victories, milestones that marked the slow but steady progress toward a more just society. The military was desegregated in 1948, opening doors that had been closed since the founding of the Republic. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s built on the foundation that the Tuskegee Airmen and others had laid, demanding and eventually winning legal protections against discrimination. And in the years that followed, opportunities expanded and barriers fell, and a generation of young people grew up never knowing the world of segregated water fountains and separate lunch counters that Marcus had known. Marcus continued to fly and to teach throughout these years, witnessing the changes and contributing to them in his own way. He trained hundreds of pilots, many of them colored men who would go on to careers in military and civilian aviation that would have been unimaginable when Marcus was young. He told his story to anyone who would listen, not for glory or recognition, but because he believed it was important for people to know what had happened, to understand what had been accomplished, and at what cost. And he watched with pride, and sometimes with tears, as the world slowly, imperfectly, but unmistakably became more like the world he had fought for. The crew of Maiden, Missouri stayed in touch with Marcus over the years, writing letters and visiting when they could. Captain Mitchell made good on his promise to spread the story, becoming one of the most vocal advocates for recognition of the Tuskegee Airmen's contributions. He nominated Marcus for additional decorations, wrote letters to congressmen and senators, and gave speeches at veterans' gatherings that always included the account of March 15th and the pilot who had saved his crew. When Mitchell passed away in 1987, his family sent Marcus a letter that had been found among his possessions, a letter Mitchell had written but never mailed, expressing once more his gratitude and his admiration for what Marcus had done. Marcus read it through tears and placed it with the original letter from 1944, the two documents representing a friendship forged in the skies over Europe and sustained across a lifetime. In 1995, the United States military officially recognized the Tuskegee Airmen with a ceremony in Washington that brought together surviving members of the group and honored their contributions to the war effort and to the cause of civil rights. Marcus attended the ceremony, now 80 years old, his hair white but his back still straight, his eyes still holding the clarity and determination that had defined him as a young pilot. He shook hands with generals and politicians, accepted accolades and expressions of gratitude, and stood with his fellow airmen as the nation finally acknowledged what they had accomplished. It was a moment he had waited 50 years to see, but the honor that meant the most to Marcus came not from generals or politicians, but from the children and grandchildren of the men he had served with and the men he had saved. They sought him out at the ceremony, introducing themselves and thanking him for what he had done for their fathers and grandfathers. Some of them had grown up hearing the stories, the accounts of missions and dogfights, and the day when a young pilot from Montgomery had done the impossible to save Maiden, Missouri and her crew. Now they wanted to meet the man behind the stories, to shake his hand and tell him what his actions had meant to their families. Marcus received these thanks with humility and emotion, knowing that this was the true measure of his legacy. Not the medals or the records or the recognition, but the lives that had continued because of what he had done, the generations that existed because he had placed himself between danger and the men he was sworn to protect. Marcus Jefferson passed away in 2003 at the age of 88, surrounded by family and honored by his country. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including fellow Tuskegee Airmen, military officers of all ranks and backgrounds, and the descendants of the crew of Maiden, Missouri, who had flown across the country to pay their respects. The eulogies spoke of his courage and his skill, his dedication to his comrades and his commitment to justice, his lifelong effort to teach and inspire and show what was possible. And they spoke of March 15, 1944, the day when a young man from Montgomery had looked at impossible odds and decided that impossible was not a word he would accept. The story of that day continues to be told. It is studied in military academies as an example of tactical brilliance and individual heroism. It is recounted at veterans' gatherings as a reminder of what the Tuskegee Airmen accomplished. It is shared in schools and museums as part of the larger history of the struggle for civil rights and equal opportunity. And it is passed down in families, from parents to children to grandchildren, the tale of the pilot who saved their loved ones and who showed that courage knows no color. The dive through the enemy formation was not just a maneuver, it was a statement, a declaration that limitations are for those who accept them and that the boundaries others try to impose can be shattered by anyone with the will and the skill to do so. Marcus Jefferson understood this, lived it, and taught it to everyone he encountered. His legacy is not just in the records and the decorations, but in the countless lives he influenced, the minds he opened, the possibilities he demonstrated. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.